I might wait just for 1 minute more to be sure that we provide late attendees the opportunity to join us, and then I say that at 2 minutes past I could start. You can hear me, correct? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Right. 1 minute more and then we go. Right. I think that we can start. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar series, Research Does Not Stop. This is the title that we decided to give to our webinar series when we were in the core of COVID times. Now the situation is getting better, so we might also think of slightly change the name of a webinar, and hopefully also to become a seminar finally series rather than a webinar one. Having said that, it is for me a great honor and immense pleasure to introduce to you, or to a few of you that might not know him already, Professor Andrea Mina, who is one of the most brilliant and gentle minds this career has offered me opportunity to meet, sincerely. Andrea Mina is Professor of Economics at the Institute of Economics of one of our sisters in GSSI. Andrea is in Pisa at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, where he's also pro-rector for international relations, okay? His research focuses on the economics of innovation, the economics of science, within which, yes, you can see on the CV, a terrific record of publication, research projects, and awards on a gallery on a variety of topics, among which, just to mention a few, financing of innovation, geography innovation too, innovation policy, and recently we see a certain focus on the enabling technologies of a fourth industrial revolution. The topic is going to talk today, it will tell you more in detail in a while, is the causal effects of R&D grants. So we are dealing with innovation policy here. So at the crossroad between two courses that PhD students have had the opportunity to take, right? My own course of economics of innovation and another policy evaluation that Alessandro Palma taught, okay? Having said that, in terms of presentation, let me remind to everybody which are the rules of the game. Andrea, you're gonna have at most 1 hour time for your presentation. If there are, spot and, instantaneous question, I would be happy to take it in the Q&A bottom, and I will actually pose it to Andrea if it is necessary. Otherwise, at the end of Andrea's presentation, we're going to have a more extended discussions with open questions and answers, okay? Finally, let me remind to everybody that, as usual, the webinar is going to be recorded. So if some of your attendees doesn't want to be recorded, you can simply leave the meet and follow the webinar on our YouTube channel, where we are broadcasting the webinar. We have, so if there are questions from them, I will be happy to take it from there too. Having said that, I finally leave you the floor, Andrea. Thank you for having accepted our invitation, and please have a good webinar.
Thank you so much, Sandro. You made me blush with your very overly kind words. I would like to thank you and Director Professor Alessandra Faggian for the invitation. I am delighted to be able to explain to you one bit of my most recent research agenda. As Sandro has suggested, I've done quite a lot of work, not only on innovation dynamics and industry dynamics, but I've become very interested in the problem of how innovation is financed in all its aspects and at each stage of its development. And I've done work on some private financing, own financing, and I'm going to present to you some work that I've done on public funding of innovation. I hope you can all find something that might pick up your interest and curiosity. I'll try to explain why I think this is particularly relevant as a topic during the current period. I will delve into quite a lot of empirical evidence, and then depending on time, I'll be quite happy to go where you think it would be most useful to engage in a Q&A. If you agree, I'll start now to share my screen. And Sando, I trust that you will tell me whether there are questions that you think I should take up during the presentation.
I will.
I don't have any vision of the chat, so okay. Apologies if there's something that I should pick up, but I won't be able to do so. You see here a slightly broader title than the one that I formally communicated. The title of this presentation is Public Funding of Innovation Through R&D Grants. It is joint work with my colleagues Pietro Santoleri, Alberto Di Minin, and Irene Martelli. We have one paper already published late last year in Research Policy, and work in progress, in fact, at an advanced stage of development. You find the detail of the paper here. It's available on SSRN, and the two papers are each a complement to the other. The first one deals with the antecedents of a particular R&D grant scheme that I'm going to describe, and the second one, which is indeed titled The Causal Effects of R&D Grants, exploits the nature of the data at our disposal to try and say something about effects in a causal identification framework. Let me just introduce the broader theme of the problem of financing small and medium-sized enterprises. Especially for those of you with a Schumpeterian orientation, it is no surprise that the debate about to finance smaller firms has maintained an edge which has transformed itself throughout the decades, and perhaps these days it morphed into a research agenda that is especially focused on entrepreneurial firms, but this is a very Schumpeterian theme. Small firms can be key sources of innovation. They are the engine of structural change in the economy, and they can foster industrial renewal by doing things that incumbents can't or do not want to do. We know from a very large body of literature that among the constraints to innovation, the availability of finance can be one of the most severe. In fact, it can be absolute and therefore binding, so that firms with good investment opportunities cannot pursue them because they don't have the liquidity that would be required to do so. Because of their characteristics, they can also not access external capital, mainly because, and here again, there's a very distinguished stream of literature, because of information asymmetries, because of their characteristics, they cannot send to potential investors enough signals that would persuade them to part with their capital and invest in the firm. Anytime we are in the presence of information asymmetry between an investor and an investee, we cannot achieve any sort of optimal or near optimal capital allocation, and this weakens the overall efficiency of the investment process. SMEs are very difficult investment propositions because they tend to have no visible track record if they're not obliged to file reports as large firms are. They are unlisted and they usually have little or no collateral that, say, banks can use as guarantee that they are worthy investments. If an SME can access external capital, according to a well-known pecking order theory of finance, there will be a wedge between the cost of external and internal funds because the external capital will only come at a premium. Internal finance is available when the firm is already able to generate its own profits. Particular problems would accrue to firms that are not only small, but also young. And here there has been a very interesting development in the literature that was once focused on firm size, and now it is increasingly focused on firm age. The problem of financing a small firm are made worse, actually quite a lot worse, every time a firm is also an innovative firm. In the case where the firm performs some sort of R&D, immediately you have an amplification of the information asymmetries that keep potential investors far from potentially good opportunity of investments. Therefore, every time you have something that contains elements of uncertainty, you would expect financial constraints to be more severe. There is plenty of evidence about the relationship between financial constraints and R&D and more broadly innovation activities. Some of this literature is more nuanced depending on the content of uncertainty or the content of signals that different phases of R&D or the innovation process entail. But however you cut a cake, you are still left from very different approaches with very persuasive evidence that R&D active firms are more financially constrained. The saving grace, which you find also in Microeconomics 101, is that in relation to R&D, you can, as the government, try and correct the underinvestment in private R&D. And that's one of the cases where government intervention is allowed even in the most market-oriented textbook. I would like to give you, before we delve into the specifics of the paper, just a few figures about first strengths and secondly the composition of government support to business R&D. And these are well-known and easily accessible figures from the OECD. This is a chart that represents changes in government support for business R&D from 2006 to 2017, or the latest available year. The figures are expressed as total government support for BIRD, business R&D, as a percentage of GDP across countries. Now, without focuses on any single country, overall, from the first year of the series to the most recent, in 27 out of 46 countries represented here, public spending to support business R&D has gone up. This figure contains interventions that are very different from one another. These interventions, and I'll show you the split in a second, are direct or indirect measures. As a whole, they account for a figure that is really quite high. It's a figure in excess of 110 billion annually. What are these direct and indirect measures that governments can use to correct market failures related to the performance of R&D? On the one hand, you have a package of interventions that are neutral relative to what firms decide to do, and typically they consist of R&D tax credit schemes. A more targeted set of interventions instead are so-called direct or directed, in that they are interventions that are given for projects or to particular firms on the basis of what they do. Okay, the solution of governments that abstain from making technological choices is obviously an R&D tax credit schemes. Here, maybe there are some surprises relative to expectations, because when you split the composition of total government support to business and try and identify the relative commitment of different countries to a particular form, a particular preference for the way in which the government supports R&D and innovation, well, you find that in a number of countries, check, for example, France, Belgium, but also Great Britain, you have a pronounced preference for tax-based incentives. And perhaps surprisingly, in relation to an economy that it is often talked about as the most market-oriented among those that we can study, if you check the US, I don't know if you see my cursor that is here, okay? The relative share of support is provided in a direct form. It is not provided through an R&D tax credit scheme. Recently, there has been good reason to expand investments that are targeted to particular societal challenges or missions. Of course, the pandemic crisis, the pandemic emergency has directed quite a lot of investments to a particular class of projects and therefore a particular type of firm. But also, if you think about the climate change emergency and you check the budget, recent interventions have boosted the commitment through direct forms that consists in the provision of grants. Okay, there are quite a lot of papers now on why giving a grant as opposed to an R&D tax credit enables government to prioritize areas. This was not an obvious choice because using grants in some of the literature has traditionally been attached to the problem of picking winners. In this case, you select problems and design a scheme whereby you provide 100% grant for a firm to deliver a particular project. And of course, some of the work by Mazzucato, Bloom, Baven-Sampat in the health era would resonate quite strongly with the idea that you can tailor direct spending by government and or government agencies towards the solution of particular sets of problems. Do these grants, and here I come much closer to the core of the paper I'm going to present, do these grants work? There are different techniques in the literature. I will select two very close relatives of our study. These are two studies that exploit quasi-experimental design to identify rather precisely the effects. In the first case, it's a paper by Bronzini and Iacchini that exploits data about grants provided by the Emilia-Romagna region, whose results are inconclusive, and the study is extremely interesting and robust and detailed, but it targets a rather narrow geographical context. Then there is an already well-known study by Sabrina Howell, published in the American Economic Review, that uses all the grants that were awarded by the Energy Department through the US Small and Business Innovation Research Grants. And she finds really significant and consistent positive effects. This, of course, has the advantage of using data that cover a broad range in terms of time, but it is a single sectoral domain. Quite recently, formally in 2014, the European Commission implemented a scheme that has very many characteristics that echo the characteristics of the US SBIR, which also makes our contribution, we think, an interesting analysis of a case of policy transfer. The agency in charge of the administration of the grants is called EASME. It's the Executive Agency for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. And we thank EASME for providing us with data that are not normally available, and the usual disclaimer applies. We did not receive funding from EASME to perform this study. This may interesting, which has already changed. It has already morphed into something else so that you cannot easily design the continuation of our study with newer data, was an unprecedented policy initiative because it was indeed the first scheme that provided direct support to SMEs in Europe. It did more than that. It targeted innovative SMEs. How did it work? And it's quite important that I spend a few words on this because the validity of our identification strategy impinges upon the very working of the scheme. The objectives of the instrument were very markedly and very clearly oriented towards new ideas, new business plans for innovations. Okay, and not just the beginning of the R&D, so the R of the R&D. We are here talking about, for those of you who use the jargon or are familiar with it, a relatively high technology readiness level, as the engineers call it. They are grants that should support high-risk, high-potential firms to bring to market new products, services, business models that could drive economic growth, and I'm citing the precise words used by the Commission. The budget over the period that went between 2014 and 2020 was rather significant. We're talking about a €3 billion budget. Any SME from any sector that is eligible under the Horizon 2020 associated country, that is 42 countries, would be eligible for the scheme. As in the case of the US SBIR, the instrument includes two possible phases, although they're not necessarily sequential. That is, firms can skip phase 1 and immediately apply for a phase 2 grant. In phase 1, if you are a firm applying to the scheme, and if you are successful, you would receive a lump sum grant of small proportions to develop a concept and evaluate the feasibility of your idea. These are short projects that would get a lump sum of 50K in euros. The big money is on phase 2. They account by far for the largest share of the budget of the scheme. You could get, if you apply and are successful, something between 0.5 and 2.5 million that should support your prototyping, demonstration, testing, piloting, scaling up, and market replication activities. There would be projects covered up to 2 years. Okay. How does the evaluation process work? And this is an exception to the evaluation process that is adopted in the, for example, normal academic research Horizon 2020 projects calls. In this case, grants are assigned by independent experts appointed by IASME to assess the projects. They evaluate impact, excellence, and the quality and efficiency of implementation. The final scores are computed by adding up median scores on all the 3 criteria, and the final scores are used to obtain the rankings. Evaluators do not know how many R&D grants will be funded under existing budgetary constraints. Also, very importantly, the evaluation process is not conducted by consensus. Experts work remotely and individually, separately from one another. Okay. In the context of the technique we're going to use, that is the regression discontinuity design, this is very important because you want to eliminate the chance, and of course you also have to empirically test that there is no so-called manipulation around the threshold. That is to say, the experts do not know how many grants will be effectively financed, and therefore they cannot exert an influence on the outcome by manipulating the scores. Okay. I will make use of this other bit of information that concerns the so-called seal of excellence. The seal of excellence is second prize. That is to say, it's a bit of a sort of a tin medal awarded for projects that are good, but could not be funded because of lack of funding. Okay. I'm going to use all the data that were available under the IASME projects for the years 2014-2017 for all the competitions of phase 1 and phase 2. We have information not only about successful firms, but also on unsuccessful bids. Okay. We match all the data with Bureau van Dijk's Orbis database records. This enables us to attach to the proposals, the firms' attempts to obtain the grants, financial information, and a lot of other interesting controls that would be extremely useful to enable us to assess the effects of the grant. We run at the firm level probabilistic matching on firm name and exact matching of country. The matching success is quite high. While BVD data had problems, the more back in time you go. In fact, the later years are actually quite good, and we achieve a 68% of successful matches in this particular way. Convergent is particularly good for phase 2 firms, so where we obtain a 74% success rate in the matching. We also use the Orbis intellectual property package to derive information about patent applications and citations. From the main data set of Orbis, we obtain balance sheet data about all the firms. We use the Zephyr component of the data set to match data about equity financing, and we have information about exit through failures and IPOs, but also mergers and acquisitions. Okay. In this simple table, I want to give you just an understanding about the Causal structure. These are the competition topics. They include a very broad range of technology areas, the usual suspects: nanotech, biotech, health, ICT for various uses, the smart city agenda, and so on and so forth. We have an overall sample size of in excess of 29,000 firms, and coverage is pretty good overall. You would have in total something like, I think it's about 3,000 and something firms that were successful in either phase 1 or phase 2, and were awarded something like 1.3 million in investments. We want to test the effects of this particular scheme. What a regression discontinuity design, which we employ, would enable you to do is to have a rather appropriate counterfactual for the firms that were successful at obtaining the grant. And forgive me if all of you know how the RDD works as a technique, but perhaps not all in the audience are familiar with the principles. So I'll give you the intuition. You have a threshold above which a firm is successful at obtaining the grant. Okay. Once you pull together all the scores, you would have a ranking of all the firms whose projects were evaluated. Okay. The most appropriate counterfactuals to the firms that were successful were the firms that were just behind them in the ranking. And if there's no manipulation on the threshold, that is to say, if evaluators do not know who will get funding, okay, you will be able, through an RDD, to compare across the threshold firms that pre-grant were very, very similar. Okay. In the RDD equation, you would have an outcome variable, a y, that is the y associated with the treatment, post-grant outcome for firm I after competition C. We are particularly interested in the size of the beta coefficient, which is associated with the observation whether the firm was above or below the threshold, that is to say, whether the firm was a treated or untreated firm. Then you have an indication of the ranking, which can take several forms. It's a polynomial control for centered ranks, and I'll see you how that is developed in the estimations. Then we decided also to include the pre-grant observation of the same variable for which we measure the outcome. This is not strictly necessary in that the research design should take care of it. If you include it and you want to be really thorough, that can help to stabilize the estimates, but it works even if you take it out. And then we have a set of fixed effects for competition, which are time-specific and sector-specific. The beta identifies a local average treatment effect. Okay, so you can establish a causal effect, but this technique does not enable you to assess the average effect of all the firms that received the funding. Okay, we use the first and second order polynomial of the running variable. The running variable, I'll show in a second what it means. It's just different functional specification of the threshold. Okay, we used OLS and we used several bandwidth. That is to say, across the threshold, we can select firms that are very close to the threshold or more distant. We can also use all the firms across the threshold. And so I will show you results plus or minus 5 positions across the threshold, plus or minus 10, and all the firms across the threshold. Okay, this is the general intuition. Now, ranks are centered because competition is different in the number of applications, in the number of applicants that try and run the race. Okay, I'm going to show you in this graph the number of phase 1 and phase 2 applicants and successful firms. When you center the rankings, you assign the score of rank 1 to the lowest rank winner of that particular competition, and the highest rank loser would get a -1 score. You have to check, and I will show you graphical evidence, that in fact firms are comparable prior to treatment. That is to say, the firm that you are comparing had similar characteristics, and the post-grant outcomes must be a consequence of receiving the grant. This also enables me to show you the very different outcomes that we test in the papers. We measure the post-grant performance of firms in terms of patents weighted by citation according to standard economics of technical change literature. We test the probability that firms received private equity, PE. This is quite interesting also in the eyes of the policymakers to assess whether this particular instrument is a good bridge to take the firms to the point that would be required for private investors to put money into the innovative business. Then we want to test the effects on revenues, on assets, on employee growth, with a number of controls. And as you can see, by fitting a first order polynomial and a second order polynomial, we expand, well, in fact, we restrict in each sort of 3-column set the bandwidth from all the firms across the threshold to plus or minus 10 in the ranking, plus and minus 5. Okay, here we want to verify that the samples in terms of pre-grant covariates are in fact balanced. Okay, I'm going to focus on the most balanced of the two, that is the effects on phase 2 that become better and better as you approach the threshold, and in fact that is what you would expect. This is a visual representation of the discontinuity in terms of outcome, okay, in terms of specific performance effects. And from the graphical evidence, it's very difficult to sort of gauge more information about the distribution of what happens to the right-hand side of each of these 6 graphs. What matters is that you get an intuitive understanding that there is a discontinuity. The econometric test, in fact, in the paper, there's plenty of tests about the lack of manipulation around the threshold. Okay, so there is discontinuity in side-weighted patterns, private equity obtained post-grant, asset employee revenue growth, okay, and the likelihood of failure. I'm going to show you at least 3 sets of results, okay, very briefly compressing all the controls. First of all, I'm going to show you that the R&D grants do indeed cause an increase in the number of site-weighted patents for the firms that were successful in the scheme. Okay, and here you see the different modeling of the first order rank times grant and second order, okay, rank square times grant of the running variable. The estimated increase in quality adjusted patents is in the range of 15 to 39%, and the results hold whether you take simple dummy variables for the outcome or whether you use negative binomial models as it's done in part of the literature. So 1. 2. Do R&D grants increase follow-on private investments, and in particular private equity investments? You want to check, and that is especially desirable from a policy viewpoint, do the funds that receive the grants become self-sustained in terms of attracting the interest of private investors? Yes, indeed. You observe a 3-fold increase post-grant that the firm receives venture capital funding. Okay. 3. Do you observe outcomes that speak to the growth of the firm? Yes, in terms of assets. Yes, in terms of employees' growth. Yes and no in terms of revenues. Okay, the results about revenues are weaker, as you would expect, given the relatively short period of time that we are observing, and also the fact that there is more uncertainty when you take into account the market uncertainty about a product market niche. The time span is indeed short, in fact, a lot shorter than the time span observed by Sabrina Hauer. And I was quite surprised about the strength and the magnitude of our results over a relatively short period of time. In terms of increasing assets, you have a range of results in the order of a 46 to 96% increase, 21 to 30% increase in employees, and 15 to 25% increase in revenues, although, as I said, the results are a little shakier. I don't want to sort of present too many results, and I'd rather show to you some tests of heterogeneity, which I think are quite interesting. And secondly, a little work on that seal of excellence that I very quickly described. In examining firm level outcomes, so we find expected, well, let's say positive effects in the expected directions for investment in fixed access, the capacity of these grants to decrease the probability of failure of these firms, shakier results, again, given the time span, on the likelihood that the grants directly takes the firm to a positive exit via an IPO or acquisition. I would like to show to you, and that connects back to the points I was raising about financial constraints, and then I want to say something about country and region effects. If there are no market failures in the provision of capital, you would expect that the grant has no effect on firm level outcomes. In the paper, we run a batch of tests to prove that grants are particularly useful to the firms that we know from the literature are expected to be more financially constrained. So very quickly, tests of heterogeneous effects across firm age and size prove that these grants are especially beneficial for the smaller and the younger firm in terms of size of the coefficient. And here we split the sample by median, okay? Both for size and for age, you see those negative effects across the board, with the exception of revenues and the probability of failure for the heterogeneity test on firm age, negative and statistically significant effects. This is an exercise that should further persuade you that these grants are very effective to counter the problem of financial constraints. We code, again, and split the sample according to median values, two indicators of financial constraints. The first one being the CFA and the second one being the TNG. The first one really should capture, we borrow both indicators from the literature, and they work with the ratio of tangible assets over total assets, okay? And they should really show to you that the most financially constrained sectors obtain the best advantages from the R&D grant scheme, and that is indeed the case as you would expect. This is also interesting. This is a scheme that covers 42 countries. Where is the scheme most useful? Here we take two indicators of health, GDP per capita in terms of health of the economy, and the second one is an indicator of financial development, again taken from the literature. Very interestingly, it's the relatively less developed countries that gain the best advantages from the scheme. One exception to the greater advantage accrued to relatively less developed countries is found in the probability to obtain private equity. And this is not surprising because it's most likely a supply side factor. Only in the countries that are more financially developed and have higher GDP, you would find the private equity tools that firms could exploit post-grant. Okay? This effect across more or less developed regions, less developed economic aggregates, is also found for regions. That is to say, it's the relatively less developed regions, those areas where firms seem to gain the largest advantages from the grants. I'm drawing to a conclusion. I want to show you another set of results. There is an interesting stream of literature that concerns the effects of signals. And signals are very important in the investment game. In our data, we can imagine two mechanisms able to drive positive results from the grant. The first one, and that also followed the content of my presentation, has to do with funding. Okay, firms are more successful because of the additional resources they get. It could also be that the grant is a signal that conveys the information that is relevant for the market, and in particular, information that might be relevant on the capital market. Okay, if certification is in place, you would expect lower information asymmetries and a reduction in the investment risks. Now, in our observations, we have this little stamp of quality, that is the seal of excellence, attributed to the firms that were good enough but didn't get the grant only because of existing budget limits. Okay. Now, we can use this particular set of observations to test the idea that if certification is at play, you would expect firms that receive the seal of excellence, but not the grant, perhaps to do as well as the grant-winning firms. This is not the case. Okay, I'm just going to show you one set of results. Grantees systematically outperform SOE recipients. Okay, we did all sorts of other checks. We also compared the performance of SOE firms with the other unsuccessful applicants. The reasoning being, okay, these are the firms that did not get the funds. Okay, would the seal of excellence be enough to improve the performance post-award, even if they didn't get the grant? Well, there's no evidence that firms that received the seal of excellence outperformed the other unsuccessful applicants. Okay, so overall, we do not find any evidence that certification is at play. It is really the money. Okay, it is really the funding that carries the firm forward in terms of economic outcomes, or carries the firm forward across stages of financing. Okay. We run all sorts of falsification and robustness tests, which I will not inflict upon you. They are all in the paper. They include placebo tests, all possible variations in the way you select the bandwidth, different standard error clustering. We ran diff in diff, a set of diff in diff. So you can imagine that the appendix is quite voluminous. We also ran a few robustness checks on the composition of the sample. For example, we took out of the sample firms that were financed in the area of health, which might be particularly important in this area. You have very large grants, and this is normally an area that all of us who study the biopharmaceutical sector know can be quite different in terms of the sheer volume of the R&D intensity. But if you take these firms out, the results are in fact unchanged. So let me conclude, and I should be pretty much on time. In this study, we make the claim, we try to make the modest claim, but indeed these data are rare, and we are very grateful that we were able to work with them. They cover very different sectors, and it's one of the few cases where we observe evidence that is not informed by US data. So in that, we believe that there's value also from a European policymaking perspective in this particular exercise. And also the fact that this particular scheme can work outside the policy context where we now know it can work very well. As I suggested in the beginning of the presentation, this is indeed a case of a policy transfer because this scheme replicates a number of the rather interesting characteristics of the US SBIR scheme. We find, we believe, persuasive evidence of significant, large, especially given the time frame, and positive effects on innovation output, investments, different types of growth, access to equity finance, and the chances of survival. We do indeed find results that are consistent with the view that R&D grants address imperfections in the capital market. They do alleviate financial constraints, especially where we know from the literature and the prior art, where we know that we should expect them. This is both true in terms of reliance on external finance or reliance on liquidity of sectors, or the degree of development of the financial system of a country, and the size of the economy. We think the evidence is quite persuasive on the fact that it is the money, it is not signaling. The results are, if you like, in line with the results I began with, but they are particularly in line with the results provided by Sabrina Howell on the energy sector in the US. Of course, there's plenty of work that could be done. I think we have already 80, 90 pages quite easily of robustness checks. So perhaps it would, I quite like sort of long papers. I've committed this in a number of times now, but I think in this particular case, it's worth it. Let me just add another point. There is a renewed interest in the role of government and mission-oriented research. Sometimes it matters what type of government intervention you are observing or you are advocating. This is a type of government intervention that does apply broad criteria of selection to worthwhile projects, but it does apply selection to smaller and younger firms with growth potential. It's not a case of picking large incumbents as winners. That should weaken some of the arguments in a very Schumpeterian way against a very heavy top-down, overly selective and maybe biased approach by governments. On the certification effect, the fact that you have rankings and labels about firm quality might not mean that this particular exercise is useless, because it is possible to conceive of additional funding that would, in fact, send resources, government resources, for example, by nation states, to the firms that receive the seal of excellence. But it is indeed the money. It is not just about signaling itself and then the market does the rest. I iterate the point about the fact that this is a study that we are quite convinced is persuasively causal in terms of the single firm, okay? It's very hard on the basis of this data on this particular design to make comparisons across schemes, even if you had all the available data. My conjecture is that this kind of intervention will likely grow as societal challenges become more pressing. The fact that such good results are obtained in this scheme doesn't disqualify the value of some R&D tax credit schemes, even though, of course, the question is, do large firms really need an R&D tax credit scheme? Would an enlargement of the scheme connected to younger firms and their growth prospects be relatively more effective? It is a question that I think is worth thinking about, as well as perhaps spillover effects of these particular grants, which might be tied to places, okay? And this is perhaps one stream of further research where we can still exploit the privilege of working with this data. I'll shut up now, and I thank you for your attention. I wait for the wishes and orders of the chair. I'm happy to remain in present mode. I can also stop sharing the screen.
Right, the chair is here. Thank you very much, Andrea. That's been really a fascinating presentation. You have been everything, punctual in time, clear, gentle, introducing technical things. So really, really great, as usual. Now we have now time for some discussion. We have a routine here usually, Andrea, which is trying to give the priority to PhD students, and then afterwards colleagues and staff might add their own questions. So I now speak to those PhD students that are here and ask them if they want to inaugurate the set of questions for Andrea. Anyone wanna, among the PhD students or young scholar, pose a question to Andrea? Okay, so Alessandro Palma, you're not that young, so please hold. Let's see if we have some students around. Not yet. Maybe no. There's Andrea Belmartino. Let me read. Mrs. Spa, regarding the grants, are general grants, or can you read it, Andrea, as well, or not really? Is in the
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I read it perhaps for all of you who can't read it. Regarding the grants, are general grants, or is there a target group, like for example by size, sector size, and age? Because in some cases the calls are directed to specific firms' characteristics. If this is the case, there will be some companies that could have more probabilities of success. Thank you, Andrea, for the question. They are general in as much as they target SMEs. Okay, SMEs are eligible from any of the 42 countries that can apply to EU Horizon programs. There's a broad variety of sectoral groups among the firms that apply and receive the grants. There is no direct bias against all the firms, but yes, as I said, on size. Okay. Yes, you may imagine that some firm characteristics are associated with the probability of winning the grant. In this particular exercise, though, all my efforts were targeted to persuading you that these don't matter, don't exist, and are washed away by the particular design that should isolate the causal effects. I'm very happy to send your way both of our papers, and perhaps you'll find something that could interest you on this particular topic.
Right, thank you, Andrea. So maybe that we might leave to students time for warming up, and I give a word to Alessandro Palma, who raised his hand. Alessandro, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Hello, Andrea. It's nice to meet you virtually, and thank you very much for this very useful and original piece of research. I have a couple of questions, brief questions, and a couple of comments. So, first of all, I'm quite surprised that you find effects that arise just after receiving the funds. Since I have a similar work, similar policy tool, analyzing export and other outcomes, but I find effects after 3-4 years receiving the funds. So that's good. So much better the firms have possibility to exploit grants just after receiving the money. And a question about the outcomes. Why do results differ between the two waves, especially those on revenues and employee and firm sides? I noticed that there's a difference. There's a negative effect, significant effect in the first wave, and positive effects in the second wave. So this it sounds strange.
I'm sorry, Alessandro. I'm not sure I understood. You mean the phase? You mean first and second phase?
The steps.
No,
phase one and phase two grants. No.
Sorry. I
wonder whether I understood wave, but I wonder whether you meant phase. That is to say, phase. I mean, type of grants that are phase one, pilot.
Oh yes, sure, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sorry, yes, not waves but phases. Yes.
Shall I pick up the questions, and then I'd be very interested to hear your comments. I apologize, I failed to take into account your work, but I'm very happy to read it. As to why we find such immediate effects, I'm myself surprised. It speaks of a very, very quick reaction of firms across the board of all the indicators. I remind you that revenues are shaky, so it makes sense because it might be too early to sort of for a firm to establish new products in the market. But everything else really speaks of firms with really good market opportunities, starved of finance. And I was myself very surprised. I'm not sure I do have an answer, but I will, double down on the surprise, because the size of the SME instrument is small relative to the SBIR. And yet the benefits are quite important. I also apologize because I failed to say this. I focused on the outcomes of phase two. phase one, as you correctly picked up, wasn't particularly effective. Okay, phase one didn't impact on pretty much anything. So anecdotally, we can say that some of this sort of soft money that was associated with some business advice in a sort of first stage of piloting of the novel idea did not produce any substantive outcome. It's phase two, again, where the money is that you find the outcomes. So absolutely, you are right. And
okay, now I found
not deemed particularly effective by the sponsor.
Okay, but I found these results on the original paper that you just mentioned at the beginning of your presentation.
Yes. Yeah. Well, to me, it's too little money, or perhaps those ideas were too preliminary to have market outcomes. Where for phase two, you really appreciate the grant filling the gap in the capital market through this particular type of targeted government intervention.
Okay, I think that both these issues are of great policy relevance. So, and I think it would be useful to stress even much more in your work because of, again, largely policy relevance.
You are right. Thank you.
Okay, now I have a couple of comments, more technical comments. I hope that can be useful. The first issue is on possible selection in the matching procedure based on Orbis. You said that around 64% of firm applications phase one and about
73 or 74 phase two.
Yeah, have been matched in the second phase. Can it be that you could not match firms that are systematically different than matched firms in the way they suppose there are strange names in a very different language than English? So I guess that very small firms or firms whose name is a very different language can be more difficult to match. So I would run some check on this issue. That's because it might be some systematic selection. I don't think so, but I know Orbis, you know, better than me. So you know that there are some firms that don't match in any way. So it might be some selection inside, I don't know. But something strange happens sometimes with Orbis. And a possible issue on the institutional setting. Are there firms that were withdrawn after being assigned, after being eligible? So I mean ex post, because of some formal checks after being eligible or because of voluntary retirements? In this case, I would compare an average treatment on the treated with the intention to treatment. And a way to do that might be to instrument the fact that firms actually received funds by excluding firms that didn't receive the funds because of some formal or legal requirements that is checked after the grant assignment. Just because I have seen the similar work that in which the mechanism was very similar. And the last issue is about selection into treatment based on some potential unobservable variables. So I know that the selection process is highly demanding. There's no direct evidence of cheating. There are multiple reviewers. The number of candidates is very large. I saw also that you ran even robustness check with additional fixed effects. So I take your results. I'm very convinced. But still, one might be concerned about the fact that the selection process is made by humans, and you know, humans really do something at random. So even if it's a multiple selection process. So for instance, in my experience in H2020 project, you know, funds tend to be assigned to few cluster players, even if the threshold is very small. And the problem is that you seldom observe characteristics that are suspected to be part of the selection. And one of these can be, for instance, the network or previous experience with EU funding, or specific informal contacts, part of the network and so on. I know that this is very difficult to control, but I mean, given that the selection process is made by humans, it might be, I think it is worth to, if possible, to test for these additional unobserved characteristics, if you have this information, of course. And that's it. Thank you very much, Andrea. Very interesting, and congratulations.
Thank you so much for your comments and questions. Yes, on the possible attrition biases of the matching, it's possible. And of course, it's a question that is asked anytime you go anywhere near Orbis data. We don't really find any evidence of that. And in fact, also my own trust in the coverage of Orbis has really improved after this work, because we know that the coverage of Orbis becomes worse the smaller the firm size or the lower firm age. These are all SMEs, and yet the matching is really quite good. Of course, it's imperative to ask the question, but we don't really find much evidence of biases. Very good suggestion on the sort of opt-out check. My guess, but it's a guess, and I have to check, is that something may have happened to the way in which the agency records the grant if the firm had pulled out for whatever reason. I would imagine also that the due diligence process is pretty thorough at the European level. Of course, I cannot claim that I know that there's no occurrence of an opt-out from the grant. I would find it very unlikely, but it doesn't mean that perhaps we should not check. On the mistrust of humans and the likelihood of human error or deliberate manipulation, because of course I mean, we have to rule out manipulation around the threshold, because that would invalidate the RDD. Of course, it's always possible, okay? We pretty much throw everything we can at the data by testing, retesting, slicing. I think the pool of experts might be actually further away from the firms that are being evaluated than the academic experts that evaluate an academic Horizon 2020 project. In this particular case, there are also rather heavy sanctions in the contracts that evaluators have to sign, should such occurrence exist. Our job is to rule out that this is a problem with the data, okay? In my view, on the basis of the tests that we run and the institutional setup, the way in which experts do not know what the other evaluators do, which means that even if there is one evaluator that has bad intentions, this is not enough to manipulate the threshold, because there are a number of other independent experts, and their scores are aggregated at the median. So this also, in my view, reduces the likelihood that this is a problem. So as much as I am not ready to say that there cannot be human error or sort of bad intentions in terms of manipulation, I think we prove in the paper that we don't see it at all, on top of the institutional checks that we know are done. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will make the honor of the house by giving priority to Francesco Rentocchini, although you're not really external because you are part of the teaching committee of our PhD. So
so Alberto should go first.
I should get you to consider yourself internal, but you are in civil. So please go ahead, Francesco.
Yeah, no, actually my question, well, thank you very much, Andrea, for the very interesting presentation, very rich paper and data and analysis. So I'm very impressed. So excellent work, congratulations. My question actually was the question that Alessandro made about, the matching with Orbis. But I can refine this a little bit and provide you with some feedback about that. So, of course, you don't have information for non-matched firms on, all the variables that you can find in Orbis and the other data sets, but at least you have like the ranking of these firms, right? Of the non-matched ones. So it might be useful to provide, for example, distribution of these firms across the ranking for treated and untreated, because if they are actually missing at random, then, these can actually at least partially confirm the fact that this is not biasing your results. While if you find, for example, the number of firms that are treated, let's say, and they are, and those, that ranking is very close to the threshold, in that case, given the bias that you have with Orbis, it's very likely that you can say that you are a bit overestimating your effect. And the same way, if you have a lot of firms that are in non-treated group that you are not able to match. So just an advice. It's like further robustness check of the 90 different robustness checks that you have in the paper, but it might be useful depending on the journal you're aiming at. If you need any clarification about this advice, just write me and I can specify it a little bit more. And the last thing that I want to ask you is a clarification about the treatment itself. I didn't understand.
It's a clarification about
the treatment.
Yes.
So you don't have any kind of heterogeneity in your treatment. So the panels never change, for example, or the rules for granting, the grant itself change through time, or these kind of things, or are they always the same, all these things? Because the treatment of you might, and if you have this information, you might want to show your result across these, different types of treatment.
Francesco, no, the rules were stable for the period we observed and then changed. And that is a bit of a problem because we can't quite easily extend the study. So now you find slightly different rules under the EIC, I think, accelerator, a grant that has absorbed the SME instrument. My excellent co-author, Pietro Santoleri, live confirms that we have run all the tests and it's table A4. This has gained, okay, your commitment to go through in detail all the robustness checks in the paper.
Excellent.
Super. Thank you, Francesco. I expect all the homework with a red pen.
Thank you, Francesco. Now, from the side of the policymakers, your question becomes even more relevant now. Now it's the turn of Alberto Marzucchi. Please, Alberto.
Thank you, Sandro. And thanks, Andrea, for the great paper. And I think I would add also for having set such a great example for our PhD students. I mean, your thoroughness in conducting your research is really an example, and I hope our students will take this as an inspiration for their work in terms of the methodology and the research question, which is obviously very interesting. I have two comments and a suggestion. Well, I don't know what they are. You take them as they come. But basically, one is typical of an innovation scholar, and another one is I pretend to be like a mainstream economist, which I'm not. So, as an innovation scholar, my question would be, like, you consider R&D as a rather homogeneous type of investment of firms. One thing that we have worked on in the last years as a community is to try and disentangle the different and the diverse nature of activities that are carried out within R&D investment. For instance, the difference between R&D. And actually, some of your analysis relates to what firms do with the money that they received from the grant. So they invest because they want to grow, because they want to patent, because they don't want to fail, and so on and so forth. So I wonder whether there is an heterogeneity in the effect if you are able to sort of distinguish whether firms have invested more in R, for instance, with the money that they received, or if they invested more in D with the money that they received, or if they invested more in basic and exploratory research rather than exploitative research with the money that they received. Because
now you are turning neoclassical.
Yeah. I'll try. I'll try. No, when I mean, I'm not gonna be able to do that.
Yeah,
so,
no,
I'm not gonna. I mean, it's okay.
You are being recorded.
I shouldn't make this statement before the question. Okay, I feel a little bit of a pressure. No, jokes apart. No, the question is this. I know. I mean, in the last bullet point of your slides, you've got something about spillovers. And I appreciate that dealing with SUTVA is a painful exercise, but I was wondering, I know that you will, I hope that you will be aiming at a very top journal. So I wonder whether I don't know whether it's a robustness check or as an additional section of your analysis, you should control for macro effects, because potentially some of your effects on technology, on economic performances of firms may result from the effect, for instance, that the money that these firms have received from the policymakers have had, for instance, on the innovation frontier or on superior technologies that have been developed and then further adopted by firms. Right? So you're dealing with a micro economic world here, and you're not looking at how the money have changed the equilibria in which these firms operate. In terms of, I mean, I would stick with the possibility that this money have, for instance, allowed firms to develop superior technology, okay, which have made all firms in a given sector more productive, for instance. I don't know whether this is feasible or not, but I think that this could add something more for that kind of audience potentially. And finally, as sorry, it's three too many probably, but potential suggestion. I think that your seal of excellence is in the seal of excellence. So you basically, I like this idea that you're able to discriminate between the effect of money and the effect of signaling. I liked it. And I appreciate the fact that it's not really about signaling, but it's more about the money. I was wondering whether you could say something about what the signaling could add to the effect of the money. Now, with the data that you have, you cannot do that because either it's pure signaling or it's money in your empirical setting. So either a firm has been treated by the money or a firm has been treated by the signaling. So I was wondering whether, for instance, you could work with a subsample of your firms and see, for instance, the interaction of the signaling effect and the money effect. I was thinking, for instance, the Queen Awards. So looking at whether, you know, the combination, I mean, you know, signaling doesn't work very much, but the combination of signaling and money does give more than just money.
Thank you, Alberto. All very good questions. On the R&D, on the nature of R&D that applicants are conducting, I do agree with you that we tend to sort of work with a undifferentiated notion of R&D, which is, of course, it's always been a problem with the R&D statistics. They are not granular. They don't tell us what firms do. In this case, grants are not really awarded for the R. Okay, so we call them R&D grants. We may well call them innovation grants because there's not a lot of money that would go to R if the projects in the description of what the money is for does not address a next to market innovative idea. So in theory, yes, you are right. We could sort of think about the fact that under the same name we capture very different activities. But in that you do find that the proposals that are sent, which we have, by the way, really address a market problem. And not just a research problem. So it's a sort of project that is too early, generally, for private investors, okay? But not too early to get this type of bridge over the value of that in the form of a government grant. So this is really about D, okay? Prototyping, demonstration isn't really the R of R&D. So I think we have a case of close to market innovative ideas across the board. Okay, and in fact, when you do split the data by sector and you can associate different innovation regimes to macro sectors, we still find pretty strong effects across the board. I think in the paper we also have the plots of the sectoral splits, and actually they're quite interesting because these are sectors characterized by broadly different innovation regimes in Schumpeterian and Ostenigo, Malherbe, etc. way. Second, I'm not sure why you would expect macro shifts. So I can see that you have cross-sectional differences, okay? But then, I mean, the rules are the same for a relatively short period of time. I appreciate that there might be institutional differences, but I'm not quite getting why this should affect the results, okay? I would expect results that have to do with, for example, the supply of private capital that, yes, might be a supply side consideration, and that might be related to institutional differences. But in this particular framework, these effects should be washed out. Now, I mean, I wish we had data about additional funding that on the basis of the Seal of Excellence could have been given to firms. But as you know, this data doesn't quite exist because, in fact, there could be sort of national initiatives that can build on the Seal of Excellence. The fact that we don't observe data, observe outcomes anyway, means that even though some nations may have started to use the Seal of Excellence, it's not enough to, in fact, the sort of annihilated difference in performance between grant winners and SOE firms. As you say, coming to your last point, we don't have the observation of the simultaneous observation of SOE or winning the grant. And I take your point about the evidence that could be derived from an award such as the Queen Innovation Award or any sort of award. But I think that's a slightly different game. I'm just thinking, I'm running ahead of the data and what we can do, whether we can perhaps add additional data and see whether any of these firms were in the running for some particular awards. But we can't really sort of test the joint effect. I take your point, but I don't really know. I mean, what we can say whether there's a signaling effect on the money, but in fact, it's the money still. You see what I mean? You can make the point about the fact that if you've received the money, you're better, and that's in itself, it's a signal, but the signal is the money. And so it's very difficult to get out of that.
Right.
Yeah, no, I get your point. Thanks.
Right. I forgot to ask to Valeria because there were some people on the YouTube, but I suspect that there should have been some question I would have been told. So no question from the YouTube, I guess, Valeria.
No, Sandro.
No, thank you very much for that. Question from the Zoom instead. Any other? Otherwise,
I do have a question. Yeah, another one.
Yeah, come on, Francesco.
No, but it's just, a question following up, these results and this signaling thing. Isn't it strange, I mean, for an expert like you, so I'm asking you as an expert also on venture capital to have no signaling effect on venture capital, apparently. I mean, you say like the money is the signaling, but then when you look at the SOE, how is it called, the acronym? I don't remember. You don't find any effect, if I remember well, on signaling for kind of private capital coming to these firms. Isn't it strange for you?
You're too good.
How do you explain?
You're too good, Francesco and Tocchini, because that was indeed my expectation. While I wasn't expecting such strong effects on the outcomes over a relatively short period of time, my original hypothesis was that we would find effects of signaling on the basis of prior research on the role, for example, of patents as signals to potential investors. But this is not what we find. And the bottom line might be that it is signaling below the available threshold of market readiness. And that's all we can say. So in a way, if you don't get the money, as a private investor, you cannot have the expectation that you have reached the investable point without the grant. But I was indeed hoping to find powerful certification effects, which we did not find. You're right. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Otherwise, I would have a question, a comment. An issue that we usually discuss with our PhD students who are here is that small medium enterprises, especially those in peripheral areas with respect to which we have a special focus, they have these inefficiencies of scales, both in production and innovation. And one way to remedy these inefficiencies is by networking among them, right? So basically cooperating, establishing partnership among them. Now, the question is, could it be an argument to expect that, although not targeted to this kind of networking, the policy you are dealing with might have an effect in this respect? That is, could we expect or eventually search for a sort of behavioral additionality in this policy? And in case, would it be possible to have data to have an evaluation of this aspect too?
Thank you, Sandro. It's a very interesting question. I'll give you an answer in two parts. I think this type of scheme, in my view, rightly focuses on single firms. They have been many experiments also under EU funding of collaborative projects with all sorts of projects. But then you also have all sorts of problems of firms not collaborating on the most worthwhile projects because they wanted to keep them for themselves as they approach the market. So if you're far from market at the pre-commercial stage, great. But close to market, it's really about your firm and perhaps your suppliers and firms that contribute somehow to production. I would expect spillovers across the value chain, even though we're not talking about very large firms. It's very difficult to establish them other than to geolocalize the firms and see what happens, for example, in local labor markets. Maybe we could track down some network ties through patenting activities or other information. I don't know. Yes, I mean, I expect effects from collaborations, but I'm glad that this scheme does not reward collaboration. And I'm also glad that it's a 100% scheme, because in this type of activities, and I'm thinking about matching funds, if firms don't have 100%, they don't even have 50%. So that's the great advantage of the grant. In terms of behavioral additionality, it's a very interesting question. I mean, we know that there are powerful effects in terms of behavioral additionality from schemes that push firms to do the first bit of R&D. So the switch is really from 0 R&D to 1 R&D, okay? And then above that threshold, you do have decreasing returns. In this particular case, I think you have firms that come up with innovative ideas, which is the second thing I really like about this project. A number of funding schemes proliferated over decades in Europe to support SMEs populations. And in fact, if you look at, for example, the willingness to engage in innovation, your average SME is not a particularly innovative firm. And the end result is that you shower across schemes quite a lot of money on firms that might not want to grow. And in this case, the scheme really targeted firms not only with growth potential, but which sought finance because they wanted to grow, with a project and a business plan that contained an innovative idea. I'm not really discarding the fact that normal SMEs remain a pillar of employment in most economies, as opposed to a pillar of value added in economies, of course. But if you really think in terms of where structural change and future employment will be, I think the evidence is quite strong that it is coming from not simply a small firm, but a small young firm that wants to grow. And that's where I would, in fact, put relatively more money.
Right. Okay.
I'm sure that I have captured the
you got my point. You got my point. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea, and for all of discussion. I think that, I mean, personally, I've learned a lot, and hopefully also go through this for the other attendees. I don't know whether we do have other questions. I mean, we are nearly at the end of our 2 hours time, so it has been a long, interesting afternoon. Any other question? No? Okay. So if there are no other questions, I think that we could stop here. What do you think? and thanks a lot, Andrea, for this very interesting and inspiring talk. It's been really a pleasure. And as Alberto said, I think that it has been really an important moment also for our PhD students to really see how research should be done. Okay, so thank you for this example, Andrea. Thank you very much. Okay, having said that, I say, yeah, I should just remind to everybody that our series of seminar keeps on until the 14th of July. So each and every Wednesday, we have our webinar. If I remember well, next Wednesday we're going to have a webinar on creative industry. If I remember well, with Alessandro Crociata and Valeria Pica. If I remember well.
Yes, it's right.
Yeah, it's correct. Good. Yeah. And therefore, look forward to meeting all of you at the next seminar. Okay.
Thank you very, very much for the invitation, the time, questions, and the comments. All that I wasn't able to address, I hope we can sort of take care of in further private conversations. And I do hope to meet you in person very, very soon.
Yeah, that I forgot to mention. Let us hope to get rid sufficiently of COVID to have you in person at the GSSI of L'Aquila, Andrea. This is really something we would really like. Okay.
With pleasure. And the invitation is reciprocal. So
okay,
you are always welcome to Pisa, which you know very well. But the invitation is open. Thank you so much.
Okay, guys. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon. Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.